Greetings and welcome to today's acrylic painting lesson. We're going to begin here with a large, damp, square-headed brush. We're using the larger square-headed brush because it can hold a good amount of pigment and cover a good amount of surface area. Now I'm applying greens to the background in between our trees, and these greens were mixed simply with primary yellow and primary blue. If I wanted a brighter, warmer green, I'd use much more primary yellow in my mixture, and if I wanted a much darker, cooler green, I'd use more primary blue in my mixture. I'm trying to switch it up and ensure we get more of a camouflaged look, as this is the foliage in the far distance, and we won't see the detail that far away. Instead, we'll just see kind of an amalgamation of colors. It'll render more of a Gaussian blur or bokeh effect. Now, from there, it's also worth noting that I threw in a good amount of titanium white and a very small amount of Mars black. I did this for two reasons. The first being, it thickens our pigment, which is actually fairly necessary because primary colors like primary yellow, primary blue, primary red are all innately fairly thin and transparent, so you generally have to do a number of layers with them. However, titanium white and Mars black are much more dense pigments. It's much more difficult to see through them, and so by implementing those into your primary color mixtures, you generally can make it so you only need to apply a single layer. Now I also used it because it will desaturate our pigment, which we want in our background. We don't want our background overtaking our foreground and stealing a lot of that attention. You want to ensure that the foreground is generally the most stark area so that it captures the viewer's attention. It's also worth noting that I'm using a damp brush because it's allowing me to drag paint a little bit farther, and it's keeping the paint wet longer so we can blend it together fairly smoothly. On the mention of blending it together fairly smoothly, you're going to want to use a fairly soft application with your brush to render a soft blend from one color to the next. If you apply a lot of pressure, it can get a little bit streaky, and you'll render something that doesn't look as soft or well blended. So again, small amount of pressure, good amount of water. From there, I'm switching over to my medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to block in the trees which we have here in the foreground. These are all going to be birch trees, and we're essentially starting with silhouettes. We'll build our detail and our highlight on top of this a little bit later once it's all fully dry. Now, it's worth noting that we're using the medium-sized square-headed brush because it innately has a very sharp edge, much like our subjects, which is our trees. So if you ever want to render something that has a hard edge, say a rock or a tree like this, you should use probably a square-headed brush, as it can hold a lot of paint and you can render those sharp edges. Whereas if you wanted to render something fairly soft, like a cloud, I would implore you to use a smaller round-headed brush instead, because it does innately have a bit of a feathered edge, and when you make that application, you won't get that harsh, stark line that the square-headed brush will render like this. You'll get something much more soft and smooth. You get something with more of a blended transition. So just keep that in the back of your head. Now, it's also worth noting that all of these trees are different from one another. That's very important when you're rendering anything in nature. It isn't man-made. No two trees should look the same. So this is occurring for a number of reasons. It's because of the ground that they're growing in, the different root systems, the fact that they're all different ages, the fact that different animals have kind of lived on them through different stages. So many different things. But to render a tree that looks natural, you generally don't have to think about all of that. What you do have to do is incorporate different intricacies that make each tree look original. You don't want them standing perfectly straight up. You want them to have different bends and movements in them. And you also don't want to break them in half or add the same branches to all of them. You want to ensure that everything is always going to be fairly diverse. Now, I would like to also note that we can see a lot of my drawing underneath that initial layer of green pigment. And we can do that because I did that initial drawing with a fine-tipped Sharpie. It will show through a good amount of pigment, but once you add enough layers on top of it, it will go away. It helps kind of guide things in the start of a painting. You don't have to use it. If you are using a pencil and or a piece of charcoal rather, don't worry, you can do that. You can rewind the video, you can see how we drew it at the start, and you can just rework that on. However, you should be aware that charcoal and graphite generally can dilute the pigment. They can make brighter pigments like primary yellow or a lighter green a little bit dirty. So instead, I would implore you to actually use more of a pencil crayon or a colored pencil. These can be much more beneficial as they don't dilute the pigment generally. So what we need to do now is let that initial layer of black dry. Then we'll go back into the painting with a bit of a gray. And I'm applying this predominantly to the right-hand side of our tree because the light will be coming from the right-hand side of the painting, and we want to establish depth through value. You make things look three-dimensional by having a light area, a medium area, and a dark area. You can also have a litany of different other transitions in there as well, but that is enough to render depth. So how do we do that? At first, we allocate a light source. Where is it coming from? If it's coming from the right-hand side of the painting, then we ensure that the right-hand side of our subjects is brighter than the left-hand side. If the light is coming from the left-hand side of the painting, then we ensure that the right-hand side is darker. If it's coming from the back of the painting, then we light both sides and the front of the subject is darker. If it's coming from the front of the painting, the middle portion of the subject is the brightest and the edges kind of dissipate and get darker. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, with that being said, here we're implementing the foliage. No, that's not true. We're implementing the bark on our tree. And I'm just applying it to the right and then I'm dragging it to the left. With the trees on the far left-hand side, I used a damp brush, which allowed me to render a fairly soft, smooth aesthetic. Whereas this tree, this larger one in the middle, I'm not using any water, and you can see that I'm getting much more of a grainy and toothy aesthetic. Neither of which are right or wrong. It's all about what you prefer. In this lesson, I wanted to show you a couple of different ways to render these trees and branches, and that's what we're aiming to do right here. Now, it's also worth noting that these trees are not finished. We are going to add a lot of additional highlights and detail to them. Right now, we're just throwing on that middle layer. Again, for depth, we have the bright highlight, we have the middle tone, and we have the dark tone in the very least. Then, for these trees to the far right, I'm applying a line and then I'm dragging it backwards. That's the third way of rendering the edge of the bark here for our birch trees. I think it's actually my least favorite as it looks the least intricate and detailed. But that can be a good thing for pieces of your trees in the far distance, as you won't see a lot of detail anyway, because that does dissipate the farther you get back in your painting. Again, in the distant areas of your painting, you want things to be less saturated, less dark, and less detailed. In the foreground, you want a lot of detail, a lot of saturation, and your sharpest values. Now, from there, I'm getting a bit of a lighter gray. I'm applying that to the right-hand side of our trees, and yet again, I'm moving it backwards in the same way I did our second application. However, I'm not moving it back as far as I do want portions of that first application of gray to show through. Now we have a light portion, we have a dark portion, and we have a middle portion. This renders depth. This renders a difference in values, and it's a great start to our paintings. So this is all you technically really need to do, but we can do a lot more with this lesson, and I intend to show you how we do that. But right now you can see that I'm kind of jumping back and forth between different trees, touching up different areas, adding more highlights here and there, and that's because I want to ensure that everything moves forward cohesively in the painting. I want to ensure that one tree isn't significantly brighter than the others or significantly darker than the others. While we want all of our subjects to be slightly different, to be themselves, to have their own personalities, we also don't want them to be too stark. We don't want them to look out of place, and we want them to look cohesive. So we go back and forth between different subjects to ensure that we are using the right values and the right colors. Now from there, I'm taking an even brighter gray and I'm beginning to implement that yet again. Here you see I'm blending back, but I'm blending back much less. So every time we add the next highlight, we blend backwards less and less. And you can see that now I'm using a bit of a dry brush on the other trees. I'm using a bit of the wet brush on our main tree. And I'm just blending the techniques a little bit just to, again, make it more cohesive. But I think it also makes it more interesting when you incorporate more than one brush stroke styling. So we're off to a good start here, and I'm fairly happy with it. Here we're just doing more touch-ups. Here you can see we're doing more of a dry brush stroke by the fairly grainy aesthetic that is being rendered, and we're just moving back and forth. Then I'm going to take some Mars Black and create some different pieces in our birch trees. This is a fairly distinct thing that you'll see on their skin or bark, and there are these little lines. They're going to surround the tree. We want to ensure that we're not applying them to the same place on every tree and that they're different sizes on different trees. It's also worth noting that the left and right hand side of these are generally more tapered. They're smaller, where the middle portion is a little bit larger. These are indents in the skin of the tree, and it does need to be darker. They are more shadowed and they don't have that highlight. But pieces of them do tend to protrude, and when we're doing that, we want to ensure that that area is catching more light from the sun. So we're going to add pieces of highlight to the top portions of these with a fairly light gray, arguably the lightest gray we've used. And it's creating a lot of additional detail and depth within our tree. So it was a very easy thing to do, but it did so much for the piece and the painting. That's generally something to keep in mind. A lot of the starting process of your paintings, it's going to be much more time intensive. It's going to be a lot more rough. You're laying the foundation for something, right? Whereas that last 10% of the painting, that last 15%, you get to add in all the detail, all of the easy little fun pieces, and they generally make your painting really come alive. Now we need to let the painting dry before this next layer, so that's why you saw that little black screen. But once it's dry, which should only take 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to take my smaller square-headed brush and a mixture of titanium white and primary yellow. Then in a tapping motion, I'm going to render all of these different little leaves here in the foreground. Now because these trees are so close, we will see each of these leaves, as you can see, and I'm running into a bit of an issue where a lot of them are transparent. And that's happening because we didn't use enough titanium white in our mixture. When you're doing this, I'd implore you to use more titanium white than primary yellow. And if you find that they're too desaturated, you can go back over them later with additional yellow. But right here, I'm just trying to ensure that a lot of these leaves are moving out in different directions, that they're not all just horizontal. Some of them are moving upwards, some of them are moving downwards, some of them are diagonal. Much like our trees, we want to ensure that they are different and diverse. It's also worth noting that we're creating them in different clusters, and here you can see that I'm putting some in the far distance and background. Because these ones are farther away, they're going to be much more abstract, they're going to blend more, and they're not going to be as distinct. Then when we put them on top of our trees and over our trees, they're going to be much sharper and they're going to be much more themselves. They're not going to be as unified, they're not going to blend to the same extent. We want to ensure that those ones are much more distinct and unique. So I'm just kind of moving back and forth in different areas. Again, we do that to ensure that our painting is nice and cohesive. And if you really want to ensure that the leaves in the foreground stand out, I'd implore you to use a second layer on top of that first layer with more of a primary yellow, because the mixture of titanium white and primary yellow will desaturate them. It's initially necessary to kind of incorporate that first layer, but later on you do need to go back and bump up that saturation. So there you could see that I just fixed a little bit of the tree in the foreground, and the video is getting a little bit long, so I switched to a speed painting. I sped up the footage here, and I did that just so I didn't take up too much of your time, and because we weren't doing anything new. At this point, we're just doing touch-ups. We're adding more highlights to the edges of our trees, we're adding more little breaks in the trees, and we're adding some additional foliage as well. All of this is being done with that smaller square-headed brush because it does such a great job for detail and sharp edges. And I'm just kind of moving back and forth between my subjects until I feel the painting is well balanced. But there we have it. There is our painting. I truly hope you enjoyed. I hope that you learned something. If you'd like to learn more and you're new to acrylic painting, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like hour-long lessons like this, I offer those over on Patreon. Again, link in the description. I post new videos every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and above all, as always, stay creative.